This is a 3-story saga about a nasty HOA Karen and the drama with OP. Darling Debbie and her spouse. Debbie lived directly behind our house. She lived alone except when her husband, Fred, came to mow the lawn, do yard work, and get yelled at in the yard in front of the entire neighborhood. There were several occasions that made us more than a little concerned. Whenever Fred came over, the neighbors on the street that she lived on would call all their children into the house. I mean, one minute there would be 8 to 10 kids playing, and then ghost town. This is because Debbie would go out front to greet Fred in a very bitter manner. The following conversation took place on a beautiful Saturday morning. Fred getting out of his car, "Hey." Debbie cutting him off, "Where the heck have you been? I've been waiting all freaking morning." But honey, it's only 9 a.m. Debbie cuts him off again. "Exactly, you should have been here at 7. Well, I said I'd be here at 9, and I'm freaking here. Shut the heck up." Debbie throwing the newspaper at Fred. "Don't you freaking talk to me like that. I'm your wife. Now get your butt to work." These were their normal conversations. Sometimes they were much worse. Another Saturday morning, we noticed Fred sitting on the patio in a lawn chair. He was visibly ill. His face was beet red, and we were concerned that he was having a heart attack or a stroke. Debbie was not going to allow her husband to sit idle while he still had chores to attend. She berated him mercilessly until he just got up, didn't say one word, and left. He was back about 2 weeks later. Debbie hired 2 handymen to enclose the lanai. They put windows up in the peak of the roof and 5 sets of sliding glass doors all the way around. It was so much nicer to look at from a neighbor's perspective. Debbie is somewhat of a hoarder and had so much junk on her lanai, it was so nice once we didn't have to look at things that she picked out of the trash. Not against dumpster diving or upcycling, but she never did anything with the stuff. By far, the most disturbing incident with Debbie and Fred happened on a Saturday. Fred only came to do chores on Saturday, and the rest of the time, he lived in a small apartment alone. After Debbie had had the lanai enclosed, Fred hadn't been over for a few weeks, and he was furious with Debbie when he saw the work that had been done. We couldn't see them since the lanai was enclosed and had blinds in between the glass on all the sliding glass doors, but we could hear them. Fred goes, "What the heck did you do?" "I had to get something. I couldn't just look at the neighbor's ugly yard anymore," referring to our yard. "You never even asked me. This cost me $15,000. Where am I supposed to get the freaking money?" Fred is actually retired. Now, screaming in a language that I don't understand, Debbie goes off. And after what truly sounds like fighting, they come out into the yard. Debbie has collected every piece of wood that the contractors hadn't used and every piece of scrap that they cut and were going to discard. "What am I supposed to do?" Fred says. "I need you to cut all this wood 2x4s so that I can burn it in the fire pit." "I didn't know that's what you needed today. I don't have a table saw with me. I'm going to have to come back next weekend to cut this wood." "I have a saw you can use." "Where'd you get a saw?" "One of the construction men left it one night and I took it." Debbie goes into the house and comes out with a handsaw. Fred goes, "This won't work. It'll take a week to cut all this wood with this little saw." "Then we need to get started." Fred tries again to explain why this just won't work, but in the end, he attempts to cut up some of the wood. Now Debbie only has the saw and none of the other equipment needed to safely cut wood, but they attempt to improvise. There is a small concrete bench in the yard. Debbie places a piece of lumber on the bench and stands on the board so that Fred can saw it down to a manageable size for Debbie to burn. This was pretty amusing to watch for a while, until Fred just stopped and told Debbie that he can't do this by hand. Debbie insisted he try again, and Fred complied, and while he was sawing, Debbie jumped off the board and it snapped back and hit Fred in the head. Fred's head is now bleeding profusely. Fred goes, "What the heck did you do that for?" "You need to listen to me. When I tell you to do something, you do it." "Well, I can't work now. I have to go to the hospital." Debbie picks up the board and holds it like a baseball bat. "What are you doing now?" "You can't leave. You're not finished. You can go when all the wood is cut." Fred had enough. Debbie is blocking his path to leave. Fred just backs up and goes around the house to his car. This part was relayed by another neighbor, and as Fred got into his car, Debbie came running from the backyard and hit Fred's car with a 2x4. Fred flipped her the one-finger salute as he peeled out of the driveway. Debbie never got the wood cut. She attempted to burn the 6-foot lengths of lumber in her small fire pit. until the fire department and police showed up because of the smoke. That's Debbie. Demanding Debbie never liked us. Posted by SnooMuffins9396. Backstory: Spring 2015, and we were relocating from the East Coast to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. We were moving into a hot market, and houses were getting 12 to 20 offers each. Super stressful for buyers. We had looked at dozens of houses in the area, and we were outbid on all of our offers. My husband decided that we needed to up our price to find something decent. We asked our agent to show us something in a beautiful neighborhood within our new price point. We walk into a beautiful home. The kitchen was almost perfect. It was a designer spec home, meaning the builder built the home without a specified buyer in hand to finish the block and move to the next section of the subdivision. The designer who chose the finishes really did a phenomenal job. The house had nearly $150,000 and more in upgrades. In our initial walk around the property, we see a lady, Debbie the Karen, come out of the house behind us and just stare. I waved at her because I wanted to make a good impression on our possible neighbor, but she just stared at us. We exit the front door and go back to the sales office with the keys to speak with the salespeople. They were super helpful, and I mean really helpful. They explained that the house had been completed almost 6 months earlier, and they haven't had any legitimate offers that the builder would accept. They gave my husband the breakdown of all the upgrades and what the house was initially listed at, and each price reduction and date. We asked about the lady behind the house, and they all rolled their eyes and laughed. Said she was harmless, but a major pain in the behind. As we left, the salesman told us what the last offer was on the house and said to just go a little above it and we would be fine. We went to lunch with our agent to look over everything about the house, and we loved it and decided to make an offer. Our offer was accepted and we got a great deal. From the initial listing price to our offer, we saved over $175,000. Now, it should have been a huge red flag that they were willing to let this property go at that price. After we move in, we meet the neighbors next door, Jim and Amanda, and they are lovely people. But we only see Debbie come out to stare at us and our house. Jim and Amanda tell us that Debbie was one of the original homeowners in the subdivision, and they were too, and that Debbie has scared away countless potential buyers for our house and the house next door by staring and making people uncomfortable. Everyone else we met was very welcoming. Things with Debbie started slow at first. We needed to put up a fence for our dogs. We had approval from the HOA, and the day that our contractor arrived to start installing fence posts, Debbie lost her ever-loving mind. HOA rules stated that the fence must be put right on the property line and that we had to install a 4-foot-high split rail fence with hog wire for the dogs, not a privacy fence. That is exactly what we were putting up. Debbie tried claiming that we were trying to put our fence on her property and she was calling the police. The police show up with sirens and lights and the whole show. She called 911, and Debbie is screaming that the fence installers were threatening to kill her. The contractor and I are just standing on my deck trying not to laugh. She said we were calling her really offensive names. We weren't, and that we were trespassing in her yard. The officer asked Debbie to point out who said what, and she proceeds to point at 3 of the fence installers. The second officer approaches us to get our side, and the contractor shows that we have HOA approval and the survey showing all property lines, and tells him that the 3 men she is accusing of harassment speak limited English. So no way they've said anything to her. Then Debbie doubles down with the trespassing and trying to say that we were putting our fence on her property. The officers ask to see the property pins, and my contractor tells them that Debbie pulled them up herself as soon as she saw where the fence would be constructed. The officer found the pins in Debbie's yard. Turns out, Debbie had been encroaching onto our property for years. Her house was built about 7 years before ours, and she had been planting about 6 feet past the property lines. We got our fence installed about 4 inches shy of the property line, and Debbie received a warning for pulling property pins. Now, as a side note, this is obviously a well-to-do neighborhood with many houses in excess of $2 million, and Debbie used empty beer bottles buried neck down as her border for various planting beds. She did this to keep the water out. When the fence was complete and I had the task to remove all the beer bottles, Debbie watched me the whole time, I asked her if she wanted them back, and she never answered, demanding Debbie does laundry. Debbie was the neighbor directly behind our property. Our HOA didn't allow us to put up any kind of permanent clothesline. Temporary lines were okay. And this did not deter Debbie. Every week, year-round, Debbie would wash her clothes in a very large stock pot on a hot plate on her covered lanai. Think Granny from the Beverly Hillbillies. She also did all of her cooking outside on the hot plate. And then hang them to dry on her outdoor furniture, draped over bushes and even on our fence. My poor husband would get too embarrassed to ask her to please stop hanging her underwear and bras on our fence, so I had to approach her. I asked her to please hang her things somewhere else because I was worried that our dogs might pull them off the fence and damage her clothing. Debbie looked at me incredulously and said that she could use her side of the fence any way she liked. We don't want to get our neighbors in trouble with the HOA, but this lady was purposely pushing all our buttons. We took a few photos of her laundry and contacted the HOA to ask if anything can be done. When they asked for the address and the name of the resident, the HOA rep just sighed. Apparently, they had been dealing with Debbie for a long time. They said they would contact her and for us to let them know if she does anything to retaliate. The HOA contacted us about 2 weeks later and informed us that if she hangs anything on our fence again, that we could do whatever we wanted with the items. Debbie hung her laundry on our fence a few weeks later, and after she went back into her house, I walked into my yard with my dogs and I grabbed one item and I went back into my home. I did this every time she hung something on our fence. Debbie never questioned me about it. Neighbors told me that she believed that there was some kind of underwear thief roaming the neighborhood and to be on the lookout. Now, I didn't touch her clothing with my bare hands, and I only handled it with a glove. I put all of her clothing in a box in our garage in case she ever asked me. I put the full box, a large shoe box with about 7 items, on her side of the fence about a week before we moved away. And FYI, the HOA was extremely reasonable. They would send letters and rarely ever find residents. Debbie had called the police for the most mundane things, and I didn't want to get her in any kind of legal trouble, and I also don't like bothering the authorities with this kind of petty stuff. The name Demanding Debbie is only used as an alliteration. Her name isn't Debbie, but she would often make ridiculous demands on the neighbors. Debbie Downer's a Karen. Have you ever had to deal with somebody like this? Holy cow, man. The HOA illegally fines me, but I'm not even in the HOA. Here's how I fight back. Click the video on your screen. You don't want to miss the crazy fallout of this one, and I'll see you there.